Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give ourselves another minute for colleagues and friends to join us, and then I'll kick us off. Okay, let's begin. This is day 3 of the Equity Imperative. And on behalf of the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and our partners, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Center for Public Impact, I'm so pleased to welcome you, and some of you to welcome you back for the final session of our 3-day discussions this week, which is happening in the lead up to the 76th UN General Assembly. And this conversation on what we've called the Equity Imperative is a collaboration between these 3 institutions. And we are looking to continue to influence the conversations also to happen among the leadership at the GA. So over the past 2 days, it has been a rich set of discussions, really unpacking a lot of issues around what really do policymakers, leaders, communities, private sector, and the international development community, what do we need to really do to move towards that more inclusive, more equitable economic system? Where have we made mistakes? What can be done differently and be done now? So today, the focus, we've taken on different days, different areas to focus on, and we're looking at it from the climate lens, which is very much about intergenerational equity, but also today, what can be done to accelerate that movement to greater justice and greater equalities. So as illustrated very vividly and maybe quite ominously by the 6th assessment report of the UN's International Panel on Climate Change, we all know the impacts of climate change are far more widespread, far more aggressive than even known before. And the Earth, we know, is likely to be hotter now than it has been at any moment since the beginning of the last ice age, and that was a few years ago, if one recollects. Now, we have political events, especially around Afghanistan, Myanmar, etc., that may have taken our focus off this very pressing development emergency. But at the end of next month, Glasgow will host the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties and involve thousands of negotiators. So this will be the world's last best chance to get runaway climate change under control. And not just through words and commitments, but money and actions, serious investment and policy change and institutional change behind it. So I want to, in helping to gather that momentum and to keep raising the bar on this level of ambition and actions that have to follow the promises, it raises some very hard questions that I'm looking to people like Professor Jeffrey Sachs and our amazing panelists to speak to. 3 maybe questions. How can we create those large numbers of good jobs as we push to decarbonize our economies? So once again, it's not pushed back to us saying these are competing ends. A second is a much faster reduction in dependence on fossil fuels. We know the subsidy story, but I think we've got to kind of really make a very compelling, powerful political and economic arguments to make this happen, not by 2030 or 2050, but now. And then finally, we're still not able to marshal enough money to really push through the green transitions, the green economic transitions and nature-based solutions that are necessary. So what can make them more valued, investable propositions? So that's what I wanted to just frame in this conversation, and to help us think through some of these issues. We're truly honored today to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University to give us the keynote. Jeff, as many of you know, is one of the world's leading thinkers and influential economists. And he's taken, I think, the field of economics to places where no one dares to tread. And really said, look, if we're going to tackle some of these complex global problems, we've got to come at it from that multidisciplinary thinking and be very open to what other disciplines bring to it if we're going to be on top of our game. So such a pleasure and privilege to now hand the mic over to you, Jeff.
Connie, thank you so much. And thank you to UNDP and to MasterCard for enabling us to have this 3-day forum and discussion. And it is at the start of a pretty intensive cycle of diplomacy. We have the UN Food Systems Summit about land use next week. We have the COP15 on biodiversity launching in Kunming in mid-October. We have the G20 in Rome at the end of October, and then we have COP26 in Glasgow beginning in the start of November. So it's a very intensive diplomatic period. In the meantime, we've got COVID, we've got all of the rest of the upheavals taking place. It's a very complicated agenda. I think the good thing that we have in the midst of many crises is we have some clarity about what we ought to do. We have agreed several times now on the main directions. And I think even with climate, it's important to take a broader context. The climate agreement reached in Paris in December 2015 starts by saying, this is an agreement to take action on climate within the framework of sustainable development. So it's really a partner with the SDGs and a partner with the broader sustainable development agenda, which calls on us for a comprehensive approach to societal transformation in the 21st century, so that we have a global economic life that is more prosperous, more inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. Now, it's such a large agenda, we have to really take it in some pieces, because no one piece of this puzzle solves the whole agenda. We need a holistic framework and a holistic approach. Climate should be addressed largely on climate, not to solve by itself the issues of social inclusion or jobs, because the climate transformation, especially the energy transformation, has some job implications, and not bad, by the way, on the whole positive, but not major. The climate and energy agenda doesn't really transform the job issue, which is an issue of its own right. The land use transformation issues also involve jobs, because around 30% of the entire world workforce is involved in agriculture. But that sector also can't solve the livelihoods question, because jobs are transforming so dramatically in the world, and we have to think about where the jobs are going to be in the future, not where they are right now. So let me try, if I can, in just a few minutes to tease apart some of these issues. The first is climate change. We're at the end of the story of discussions, debates, and so forth. Warming is 1.2 degrees Celsius in an El Nino year. it's going to jump to 1.3 degrees C. We just had a report this morning, literally coming out of the World Meteorological Organization and other UN agencies saying we could have within the next 5 years a year of 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's how rapidly we are warming and how close to the 1.5 degree limit. They put it at a 40% chance that within the next 5 years, we're going to have a 1.5 degree C world. You see, this year we're in a La Nina phase, but when we go to an El Nino phase, which is an interannual warming phase, it's going to shoot up and we're going to have disasters all over the world. This is for sure. The next big El Nino is a massive, massive upheaval for the world. You can tell our governments aren't exactly prepared for what's happening and what's coming just in the next few years. Okay, so what do we do about this? Two big categories of the drivers of global warming are the energy system, somewhere around 75% of the total story, and the other is the land use and land use change, and that's roughly a quarter to 30% of the story. Carbon dioxide by itself is roughly 3/4 of the story. The other greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorine gases are the rest. Even for this part of the bigger puzzle, we need comprehensive strategies in every country. I've been working on this for the last 10 years. I can tell you every pathway to getting to zero by mid-century looks roughly the same around the world. For the energy system, it's wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, zero carbon energy. It's electrification of everything that can be electrified. So transport, heating in buildings, industrial processes, and it's green fuels like hydrogen produced with the zero carbon electricity. And the fourth pillar is land use, to store carbon, to stop deforestation, to restore degraded ecosystems, so-called nature-based solutions. Every scenario I've read, probably hundreds of them, have these pillars. And any government that says, no, I don't like that, is completely missing the point. I don't care who you are, what level of development, which part of the world, you're gonna do this. Because the world has to do this, and every year the crises are gonna get worse, and every year the demands are going to be higher, and every year the urgency is gonna be greater. So there's no sense of saying, oh, I produce coal, I don't like this, I'm closing my eyes, in 5 years they're gonna leave me alone and stop bothering me. Everyone is gonna be bothered, okay? And more and more and more. And no one's gonna be able to build gas-fired pipelines and new fossil fuel projects and thermal plants and so forth, because soon, it's already happening, but sooner than people imagine, the banks are not going to be funding this stuff. There are going to be protests everywhere. Anytime anyone tries to build a pipeline, you're going to have to go over dead bodies because people are going to object. We're having social action everywhere. So my advice to governments is understand reality. Don't whine, figure it out. And figuring it out means figuring out the path, what to do. I'm just in the middle. I haven't finished it yet because it came out just last week. But here's a study, Solar Futures of the US government. Excellent report by our technical agencies put out by Department of Energy. I'm so happy to see it. But it's a very technical report that says wind and solar are going to be 90% of our electricity grid by mid-century. And it goes through how this can be done, what the technologies are. And you know what the net costs are compared to the present system? Nothing. Because it turns out it's all basically grid parity. It's not more expensive. It's going to happen. Despite all of the idiocy we have in the United States, and believe me, we've got a lot of idiots. We've got governors that are completely corrupt and actually killing their own people with COVID. all sorts of horrible things. We've got the fossil fuel lobby. The fact of the matter is we've got such a deep climate crisis and we have solutions. This is actually going to happen. So what I would say to all governments is you need a plan. You need your own solar future study. You need a pathway analysis because you can't make the transformation in a year or two. It's 20, 25 years of sustained change, but it has to be against a strategy. The other point about this strategy is it has to be done with neighbors. We're in a world generally where countries don't like their neighbors, or many times they don't. Oh, they invaded us. We have feuds. Goes back to 1400 to 1600, maybe the last year. But believe me, you share the wind, the solar, the rivers, the ecosystems. You better get along with your neighbors because you cannot solve this problem country by country in isolation. And I want to say to the imperial powers of the world, my own country, the United States, first and foremost, don't try to make enemies in other people's neighborhoods. Don't say, we'll support you against the other side, because we actually need regional cooperation in order to make the energy transformation. So I'm completely against this idea today in the news. Oh, we've got new alliance of UK and Australia and the United States with nuclear submarines against China. And now we'll have the Quad, the US, India, Japan, Korea, Australia against China. This is such a wrong way of thinking about the 21st century. It's extremely dangerous, it's extremely naive, and it will frustrate solutions because Japan, Korea, Australia, and China need to work together on the hydrogen economy, which is part of the zero carbon East Asian strategy. They need to have power lines that connect each other. They need trust with each other. We actually don't need more nuclear submarines, with all due regard to the generals. We've given you $7 trillion for wars over the last 30 years, got nothing for it at all. And now let's make the world safe for our children, not for more nuclear submarines. Anyway, no one's listening to me on that, but that's my 2 cents, because we are wasting our time and our money on conflict. And what we need is cooperation to solve these problems. Last point I want to make is about jobs. This transformation issue, net creates jobs. And that's because a renewable energy system is probably a bit more labor intensive than a fossil fuel system. But it's not a big deal, I'm going to say. The jobs issue within the energy sector transformation is not the main issue, though, of course, we want to make sure that the transition is fair, politically acceptable, and so on. But the energy sector employs just a few % of the workforce. It's not a big deal. And much of that will continue. Jobs are going to change tremendously in the future, but not because of this. They're going to change mainly because we're moving to a digital age, mainly because we're moving to artificial intelligence, expert systems, robotics, mainly because we're moving anyway from jobs in the productive sector, in the goods producing sectors, which is agriculture, mining, construction, and manufacturing, which are going to be done by robots, not by us, to jobs in the service economy and the care economy. So there's going to be a lot more jobs taking care of people, helping people, coaching people in culture, in good, decent activities, mainly in cities, because agricultural jobs are going to be replaced by machines too. In the United States, we feed the US and much of the world with 1% of our labor force. And it's no joy to be a smallholder farmer on a tiny farm in backbreaking labor. Professional jobs will be more remunerative, higher income, and in urban areas in the future. So we're in the midst of a massive job transformation, but it's a different issue by and large from the energy transformation. The energy transformation is an infrastructure systems transformation that's urgent. It's going from coal-fired to solar fields. It's not mainly a jobs issue. The jobs issue is mainly urbanization, service economy, human skills, and by the way, more leisure, because this is something that most of the world really needs and craves. Poor people work much harder than rich people, much, much harder. They work in backbreaking labor and they have shorter lives. And we want to end that inequity. We want today's poor people to have vacations, to have 40-hour work weeks, to be able to work in safe physical environments, and good education and transformation to a service economy, to robotics and other activities that do the hard work is actually a very good thing for us. So all of that's to say, let's have a jobs clear. Maybe we could have a workshop on jobs for the future. And I would love to participate in that. I think it's one of the great and fascinating issues. And as I say, it's not just jobs, it's also leisure. I like leisure and other people like leisure too. And I think we should be trying to promote that and culture time, family time, care time. But today we need the infrastructure of energy transformed. And that we should absolutely say, if we don't do that, all we're going to have is crisis for years and years to come, and it's going to get really dire. And I can tell you, living in the United States, we're a really rich country. In some ways, we're falling apart, so confused, so politicized, so corrupt, so many problems. If we don't get this under control, it's not like we can really handle this. So this is not just, telling other countries, poor countries, get ready. This is actually for all of us. We're just at the limits of governance capacity right now. So we had better get serious before this gets more out of control. Thanks a lot. Great to be part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I believe this is actually a special day for you because you're launching this Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition in partnership with UNIDO. So while we have you, would you want to say a little bit about that? And,
thanks a lot. For me as an economist, the main thing I learned in life, and Connie mentioned about interdisciplinarity, we know a little bit. We know how to add, subtract, divide, count money, follow financial flows. But when it comes to how the electrons move, or how our cars are going to be powered in the future, or how to create a new vaccine and so on, we had better listen to the people who know. And the people who know about the energy transition are engineers. It's completely fascinating to listen to engineers talking about how we're going to ride in vehicles, or how ocean shipping is going to work, or how we're going to manage carbon in the future. And I, as director of the Earth Institute, I had 14 years of wonderful experience of listening to all these different expert communities. And I've heard things 15 years ago that are now becoming the common wisdom, because the experts see farther than we do. They don't always agree, but they do really understand things much better than a layman. Even if we think we get it, they really understand the issue. So I've had the notion that we really ought to bring engineers more to the forefront for governments of what can you really do? What is our real potential? How are we going to do energy storage here? What's our best shot at solar? What are the cars really going to be like in the future? What kind of infrastructure do we need? And we're creating this council of engineers for the energy transition together with UNIDO, which is a great organization. which is committed to industrial development worldwide. And I'm really excited that it will help to bring this very cutting edge expert knowledge to the use of any government that says, okay, we get it, we hear you, but what should we do? And that's the purpose of this council.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. As always, a pleasure to listen to you, and thank you for that powerful keynote. Your erudition, passion, and that call for action is always very inspiring. So let me now turn to our panel, a very distinguished panel. We have Dr. Jamila Mahmood, currently the Executive Director of the Sunway Center for Planetary Health, advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and a former Undersecretary General at the International Federation of the Red Cross. We have Dr. Erniko Pandey, an atmospheric scientist with a doctorate from MIT, currently based in Nepal, and very much steeped into research in the Himalayas on air pollution and climate change. He's also a senior research fellow at IIDS think tank in Kathmandu. David McNair is the executive director for global policy at ONE, a campaign to end extreme poverty and preventable disease. This is a campaign co-founded by Bono, and a very well-known one. So let me start with you, David. You work a lot with developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the fronts for this battle against climate change is about voice and representation of poor countries and leading up to adequate finance. And developed countries promise to raise, I think, $100 billion every year in climate finance to support developing countries. The OECD says in 2018, the last figure we got was, they gave over about $79 billion. But overall, we need public finance to transition to a greener and more climate resilient infrastructure. We need that to crowd in then trillions of dollars in private finance to fund technology, innovation, etc. So what is your assessment of where we stand on the availability of finance? Are negotiators from developing countries even on the table? 6 years after Paris, what are we not doing right? So your take on some of these big issues, David.
Thanks, Horniman. It's a great pleasure to be part of the discussion. And also, very inspiring to hear Professor Sachs's clarion call for what needs to happen. At ONE, we try and mobilize citizens' voices to shift politics and convince political leaders to take action. So we're kind of often stuck in the middle between the world that we want to see and need to see, and trying to kind of shift political dynamics. And what we're seeing as we try and work with and listen to particularly African partners, and then reflect those positions in international negotiations, is that there's a real imbalance. So when we talk about climate justice, there are two indisputable facts. The first is the world's poorest countries have contributed least to the problem. And the second is that they stand to bear its impacts disproportionately. The average American consumes as much electricity in 4 days as the average Ethiopian consumes in a year. And if we really acknowledge that fact, then it has far-reaching implications for how we manage this global transition. And here are just three. First, on the negotiations, the risk is that the inequitable power structures that give rise to these global inequities are simply mirrored in response to climate change, precisely because poor countries have less power in negotiations. So those at the front line of climate change must have an equal voice in the discussions. And a starting point, of course, for that is that negotiators must be able to fully participate, despite the grotesque vaccine inequities that might prevent them from doing so at COP26. And in those discussions, a fair question, I think, to ask is whether the countries with the greatest development needs and the lowest emissions should be allowed to use more of the world's remaining carbon budget. The second is around the financing. You've already mentioned it, but if the climate change negotiations are to move forward in good faith, rich countries really need to deliver their promise on this 100 billion to lower income countries, and the US, bears particular responsibility here. The commitment was made more than a decade ago, and it has yet to be fulfilled. And as you said, about 76% has been delivered. Of that money, about 20% has gone to the poorest countries. And if you look at climate finance overall, 80% was in the form of loans. So there is a question about whether we're actually serious about a global solution, or whether this is just rhetoric. At the moment, I'm afraid to say it looks like the latter. Third point is that climate change is not the only crisis. COVID is compounding a whole series of crises: hunger, poverty, HIV and AIDS. And because of how we've managed the pandemic, we're now seeing a great divergence. The US is growing at the fastest rate since 1984, when I was 4 years old. And in African countries, the economic crisis is going to leave long-term economic scarring. So in the context of that, think about responding to the climate emergency. If you think Nigeria is going to focus on decarbonizing while it's grappling with the pandemic, then you need a reality check. Like, Nigeria can't afford to leave oil in the ground with its current debt burden. So we need a solution to that problem. The other problem here is that the vaccine issue is creating a huge trust deficit between Africa.
I'm not sure if we lost you, David. Looks like the screen is frozen. So we'll come back to you to complete your thought. So let me move to Arniko. You can hear me, Arniko?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Great. So let me turn to you. I mean, you're from South Asia, and we see that the impacts of climate change are not spread evenly throughout the world, with some places bearing a larger impact than others. It is not just coastal areas that will be affected by sea level rise, but the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, also known as the third pole, that will experience disproportionately the large impacts of climate change. So tell us, Arniko, what's going on in the Himalayas? Why should the world care about that part of the world?
Thank you, Swarnim. Thank you to everyone for the opportunity to speak here. So what is going on in the Himalaya? The Himalaya region and its other nearby mountain ranges that together make up the third pole, they contain the third largest storage of frozen water on land. This is after Antarctica and Greenland. And water here is stored in the form of ice at high altitudes accumulated during the rainy season, and becomes a major source of water in the rivers during the dry season. This is partly why the region is also sometimes referred to as the water tower of Asia. But the whole region is experiencing really rapid change. For the past several decades, glaciers in much of the region have been receding, and snow cover has also been decreasing. A large part of the region's cryosphere is showing signs of melting. In other words, the water tower is losing storage capacity. Because much of the water in the region falls during the monsoon, during the dry season, millions of people are dependent on water that is flowing in the rivers that originate in the mountains. This is particularly acute in arid regions such as in the Indus. And when you have a loss of the dry season water flow in the rivers that come from these mountain areas, you affect agriculture, and then of course, along with that, food security, also urban drinking water and hydropower. And it actually raises questions about the dream of prosperity through clean hydropower that much of the mountain region has been talking and daydreaming about for decades. In addition, when glaciers retreat, they leave behind hollow depressions behind the moraine hills, and these fill with water, and you form glacial lakes, which as the glaciers recede further grow. And occasionally these lakes break out in catastrophic floods called glacial lake outburst bluffs. And when that happens, a wall of water comes crashing down the valley, destroying everything in its path, and they destroy huge amounts of infrastructure and cause a lot of deaths. The monsoon in the region itself is changing. We're experiencing far more extreme weather events already. These trigger landslides and debris flows in the mountain areas, and then inundations in the valleys and plains, and often in urban areas as well. Here in Kathmandu itself, a couple of weeks ago, we had some of the heaviest rainfall in multiple decades, and a lot of areas were underwater that surprised everyone. So why are these changes happening? Part of it is global warming driven by greenhouse gases. Our average global temperature, as Jeff mentioned, is already more than a degree above pre-industrial. And then in mountain areas, you have what's called elevation-dependent warming due to a number of mechanisms, you get faster warming at higher altitudes. So in the Himalaya region, it's estimated that the global average of 1.5 degrees, actually 1.8 to 2.2 degrees warming in the high mountain area. Then you've got the additional contribution from black carbon and other dark particles that are mostly emitted from fires and from combustion activities. They warm the air by absorbing sunlight, and they also melt snow and ice when they deposit onto and darken white surfaces. For those of you in New York, it's a bit like what you see in the fall and autumn when a leaf lands on freshly fallen snow. And when the sun heats up the leaf sinks into the snow. As the dark leaf absorbs more sunlight, warms up more than the snow which reflects. And so it warms up the snow underneath the leaf and sinks in. The same thing happens with soot particles. These soot particles can reach from the Indo-Gangetic Plains all the way up to 5,000 meters and higher. So why should the world care? The river basins that originate in the Third Pole region, high mountain Asia, these river basins are home to almost 2 billion people, about 250 million themselves living in the mountain areas itself. The changes and increases in disaster risks that are taking place will greatly affect people who are already very vulnerable. More disasters will wipe out more assets, will increase the likelihood of reversals in development gains, put SDG attainment at risk. And water from melting Himalayas, of course, also contribute to rising sea levels. Not a lot, but the same mechanisms are also driving unprecedented melting in Greenland, and where there's far fewer people to observe the changes. Melting Greenland's glaciers and ice cover alone can put the Maldives and other flat island nations several meters underwater. High mountains experience change faster. So what we have in the Himalaya is an early and very visible symptom of a much bigger problem. And this visible symbol, this can also become a symbol to rally people to take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Arniko, for giving us that very distinct perspective on how climate change is unfolding in a region that is home to almost 2 billion people, right? So this is India, China, parts of Southeast Asia. It's a very important issue. Thank you. David, we lost you a little bit towards the end of your segment, but you were unpacking very nicely the issues of fairness, representation, all the puzzles related to finance. Maybe I'll come back to you after Zamila so that you can complete your thought and also talk a little bit about these indigenous pathways that countries should be looking at while pursuing the agenda of decarbonization. So with that overview from Jeff and Kani, and then these distinct issues that David and Arniko raised, let me turn to Zamila to give us even more sort of a multidisciplinary perspective on this issue. COVID-19 pandemic, as people have already observed, is a prime example of the types of challenges that humans will increasingly face in the Anthropocene, this proposed geological epoch that we're talking about. And scientists have pointed out that the virus is a result of the strain that humans are putting on the planet. In this case, likely by encroaching on wildlife, right? So my question to Zamila is, as you are the executive director of a new Center for Planetary Health, give us your perspective on how did we get here? What do you think we should be doing differently to weaken these linkages between pandemics and larger issues of public health and the ecological pressures that we're putting on the planet? So give us your sense of what we should be doing differently. Over to you, Zamila.
Thank you very much, Swanim, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I think the previous speakers have really, set the stage for me to come in to say that really we are not dealing with a pandemic. We're dealing with a syndemic, and COVID-19 is symptomatic of the environmental, the planetary damage that has happened as a result of the Anthropocene, as a result of man's violation of our planetary boundaries, and of course, climate change is also a result of the climate crisis is a result of all our actions as well. Now, why take a planetary health route? Well, first of all, we know that the pandemic didn't arise out of the blue. We know that it will happen again. We've heard from Aniko about the situation in the Himalayas, and we also know that the glacial melt is exposing us to many more microbes that are being released now. So, but what really strikes me, Swanim, is we all saw this coming, right? We all said it was a matter of when and not if, where we would get another pandemic. And yet we get caught by surprise again. So what Jeffrey Sachs said earlier about, our need to collaborate, to cooperate, and look at, how we deal with these major challenges is exactly what we need. The foresight from countries like mine, which are middle income countries, and the lower, lesser developed countries, the foresight exercises to help governments, to help private sector, to help civil society really look at how they address the challenges of the future and start planning for that future. So the Sunway Center for Planetary Health has just been established, is really to see how we can actually address some of these issues. If we acknowledge that health cannot happen without planetary health, and that, for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now very, very much, we're really being pushed right back because of the pandemic, then we've got to have an alternative approach to look at the challenges we're facing globally. So the planetary health approach is really, very simply put, is that humans cannot thrive in the absence of a planet that is safe and able to thrive as well. And why, what do we think we should be doing? I think we've got to demystify a lot of this. In my country, in Malaysia, the awareness of COVID-19 is way up there. Everybody knows a lot about it and everybody is an expert. But when we did the same survey about the climate crisis, the knowledge about it was extremely low, was very worryingly low. So part of the problem is that, the science behind both the climate science and the health sciences are so, engulfed in so much technical jargon. And I think we've got to make our people on this planet understand and, really take to heart that all the scientific reports and everything that people are saying out there is going to affect them. It's going to affect their families. And I see COVID-19, as tragic as it is, as a real opportunity for us to really tackle this as a wake-up call that every country in the world, irrespective of whether you're the richest country or you're the poorest, is affected. Now, the theme of this meeting is about equity. And we've seen as well in the COVID-19 crisis that, the inequity that exists, the whole issue around, the access to vaccines has been really a stark reminder of the inequality that exists globally, not just globally, but also within the countries that are affected. So I think, if at a national level, we're not acknowledging and being now exposed to the really very fragile social situations in many countries, including my own, the issue around migrant health, the issue around, stateless people in the country. So these are all important issues relevant to sustainability, relevant to equity, that are now, smack in front of our face. So for me, it's a huge opportunity. And as a region, I kind of feel really sad that when the EU came together to procure vaccines, why didn't ASEAN do the same? We would have been able to address some of the gaps, in some of the countries in ASEAN that had, really very slow access to vaccines. I think we haven't been able to come together, not just at the global level, but even at a regional level, to address some of the big challenges that we have. And I could go on about that, but I think my conclusion to your question, maybe in a short summary, is that COVID-19 is the beginning and it's a dress rehearsal, I always say that, for bigger challenges behind us, which is climate crisis, which is upon us, but also biodiversity collapse. I think that is the most frightening thing that is ahead of us. And we know we have COP15 happening very soon to look at that. The regional, national, global cooperation is key. And we've got to be, 10 steps ahead, right? We've got to start looking at things from a bigger, broader perspective, from a planet perspective, not just at a global health or public health perspective. This is bigger than that. And it's all interconnected. And, foresight is going to be critical. And, partnership is going to be key. Innovation is just going to be a necessity.
Thank you so much, Jamila, and thank you particularly for making that connection between COP26 and the other the COP that's happening, the COP15 in Kunming on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And there ought to be growing awareness on the synergies between nature-based solutions and climate change mitigation. So I'll come back to you at the end to talk a little bit more about ASEAN and some of the cooperation issues that you've already touched on. But let me go back to David and let you finish your thought, David, but also maybe talk a little bit about the green energy transition as an opportunity for African countries to be not just a victim or a recipient of compensation, but a global engine of the solution to climate change. In development economics, we talk a lot about leapfrogging and this advantage of backwardness. And there's a classic example of mobile telephony, right? I'm from Nepal, and I remember in 1991, we had only 71,000 landlines. And we suddenly went from 71,000 landlines to 30 million cell phone subscriptions in a number of years. So that leapfrogging, are there possibilities in the energy transition field as well? Because countries are so far behind in terms of energy access. So rather than going the old fossil fuel coal-based route, and what ought to be done to really make that leapfrogging and that transition? So over to you, David.
Thanks, Swarnam, and hopefully my internet connection holds up this time. I couldn't agree more with what Jamila said. COVID is compounding a whole series of crises, from hunger to poverty to HIV and AIDS. And because of how we've managed the pandemic, we're seeing what is a great divergence. The US is growing at the fastest rate since 1984, when I was 4 years old. And of course, African countries are going to see long-term economic scarring, and that has direct implications on the response to climate change. If you think that Nigeria is going to prioritize decarbonization while it's still grappling with the pandemic, you need a reality check. Nigeria can't afford to leave oil in the ground, particularly because of its debt burden. But the other part of this is that the trust dynamics that enable multilateral negotiations to work. The vaccine issue has created a huge trust deficit between Africa and the West. So the first thing we need to do is end the pandemic so that we have the fiscal and political space to respond to what is a much bigger emergency. I think around the opportunity, the good thing is, as you've mentioned, African countries haven't made many of the same mistakes that rich countries have. And if we're smart about this, we could address energy poverty, which is a key driver of economic and social deprivation, but also find ways of accelerating the energy transition. So if you look at Africa, it has the richest solar resources in the world, but has installed less than 1% of solar panels. Renewable energy potential is 1,000 times larger than projected demand for electricity in 2040. So Africa could become an exporter of energy. And of course, the energy transition needs batteries. The DRC has more than half the world's reserves of cobalt. So that's an economic growth opportunity. It's also a major corruption threat. And I think part of what we need to do there is to figure out how can we transition from an attitude that seeks to extract those resources to build batteries elsewhere, and make, develop the opportunities to make Africa a battery production hub. If you look at the evidence, we could see double-digit growth in renewables over the next decade on the continent. And that, of course, makes a compelling case for private investment. But what needs to happen for that to occur that we need a shift in risk perceptions when it comes to private investors in Africa. We need the regulatory and trade policies in place. And the time to start making that shift is now. Because as many others have said on this panel, like, we don't have time to wait.
Thank you, David, for underscoring that message of urgency. Arniko, let me turn to you to talk a little bit more about the research that you are steeped in, the air pollution and how it's affecting global climate change. Explain to us why it is so important to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and short-lived climate pollutants, right? The black carbon issue that you are quite focused on. What is the role of each, and why do we need to address both? And you can illustrate that with some of the examples from the region.
Actually, maybe I want to step back a little bit, if I have the time, and to say that adapting to climate change is really important, but not sufficient. And we can take as an example Male, the capital of the Maldives. Population of more than 200,000 and 7-8 square kilometers of land, one of the most densely populated cities in the world, sitting barely a meter above sea level. With sea levels rising, how do you protect the city? You start building seawalls. Male has already started. But how tall and how expensive a wall do you need to protect from a 1 meter sea level rise, 2 meters, 6 meters if all of Greenland melts? Adaptation is necessary in a lot of cases, but it's completely insufficient. One has to mitigate. There's a more complex example from Nepal. Just this past April, a multi-decade project to bring drinking water to Kathmandu, a city of 4 million people, was completed with a 30-kilometer tunnel bringing water from the Melanchi River. But in May, 2 cyclones dumped really unseasonably large amounts of snow in the upper reaches of the Melanchi Valley. And then in early June, we had a heavy rainfall onto that snow. So it all melted at once, came crashing down onto what little streams turning into big floods coming onto a plateau called Brematang, a sediment plateau that had sat there for many hundreds of years. And they gouged a deep canyon into the sediment deposits, carried those down into the valley. And now the intake for the Melanchi drinking water sits under 14 meters of rubble, and many houses further downstream are still buried up to 2 stories under rubble. You might think we can just dig out and move on again, but there are millions of tons of sediment still waiting exposed up there. Now, every time it rains, some of that starts coming down the valley. So adaptation requires building really expensive check dams, requires probably much more expensive infrastructure than there before. And we're talking about still being just about a degree above pre-industrial now. In the best case climate scenario of stabilizing at 1.5 degrees, we will already face much worse than what we face today. And warmer than that is unthinkable and impossible to adapt to. Even reaching 1.5 degrees requires really immediate emergency mitigation action. And I think Jeff Sachs was talking about that as well a bit. But I think it really requires weaning off of fossil fuels now completely, the whole world. And I would actually say criminalizing the extraction, the selling, and the consumption of fossil fuels. Yes, even in Nigeria. CO2 from Nigeria or from anywhere else stays in the atmosphere for a century or more, has a long-term impact, will continue to warm the atmosphere and the ocean for a long time to come. And the thing we can do really quickly right now is we can gain about a half degree of avoided warming by immediately cutting down on short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon, ozone, methane, because these have a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere than CO2. And if we shut down their source, their impact will disappear. Their current contribution to warming will disappear much more quickly. The good news is that they also contribute to air pollution and to health impacts. So reducing them has immediate other co-benefits. Cleaner cooking, better waste management, reduced agricultural burning, fewer forest fires. All of these have an immediate one-time impact on climate, but also contribute significantly to clean air, to health, to SDG goals. But it's a one-time reduction of these, a one-time removal of the added warming from them, and not addressing CO2 until during that time is also fatal. We have to do both. Only a pathway that mitigates both short-lived climate pollutants and CO2 has any hope of keeping us somewhere within 1.5 degrees. And even that's too much.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Arnigo, for that detailed exposition. Very useful to make these connections. Let me turn to Jamila, and we're about to close the session. We have another 5 minutes, but maybe in a minute or two, we talked a lot about the rich countries. We talked quite a bit about poor countries in Africa and South Asia. Can you give us a little bit of a middle income perspective? You were sitting in Malaysia, a key player in ASEAN, and otherwise very successful regional organization, relative to other similar blocks in other parts of the world. And but we saw that when it comes to COVID response, or even on climate change, or even some of these issues with a regional dimension, like black carbon, it's not a global issue; it's a regional menace, as Arnigo was highlighting. Yeah. Why did we see insufficient action, insufficient levels of cooperation at the regional level? Even with the vaccines, there was some success globally, right? When it came to development, we failed badly when it comes to distribution, but on the development front, there was a lot of global cooperation at work that is worth emulating for climate action, for example. But give us this regional sense, the inadequacy, perhaps from an ASEAN lens.
Well, I think that one of the challenges is that you don't build your strategies in a crisis. So this is where I stressed earlier on that at the regional level, there has to be a greater investment in looking at foresight for the region, in looking at what are the challenges that are coming our way, and therefore what kind of preparations and cooperation mechanisms are required. So you can't, when you are hit by a crisis like this, for many countries in the region, it's also about political survival. It's about, how do these countries face, their people who are falling sick, and, being able to, provide them the medical care and attention. So I think that's been, a major problem for the region. The second, of course, is that, we haven't built the regional institutions that are required to look at this kind of multi-purpose, multi-hazard, multi-crisis, preparedness and response. Right now, there is already advanced discussions and the establishment of an ASEAN Center for Public Health in Emergencies and Emerging Diseases. So, and if this is a hot seat of pandemics, disasters, and everything else, then it really should be a driving force and should be also a center for research and development and innovation. The other thing I want to mention is that, in some of the most populous Muslim countries are actually in ASEAN, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, and so forth. And there's been great advancement in innovative financing, particularly around Islamic finance. And one can't help but wonder why, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the OIC member countries didn't take leadership, to follow in the footsteps of what they've done before with, the Gavi Alliance Sukuk with IFIM for vaccines. We could have done the same thing so that countries in Africa would have access to vaccines, that we could then, pool enough money to procure, to be part of the COVAX facility. So for Malaysia, we're kind of stuck in the middle income trap, because when the COVAX facility, we participated, even though, we are not subsidized, so we had to participate and substitute. So what happened was that you get the developed countries getting the vaccines, you get the underdeveloped countries getting the vaccines, and then the middle income countries begging for their share as well. So it was a bit of a double-edged sword in many ways, but we were fortunate in Malaysia that we actually did our procurement as well. So I think lots and lots of lessons to be learned there, and not too late to start looking at some of these financial instruments, because we know this is going to last for a long time. There will be a requirement to continually vaccinate people. So, I think, Swanim, the whole equity issue, the whole collaboration, partnership issue is something that we just have to get right.
Thank you, Jamila, for closing on that note of cooperation, also bringing in the OIC middle income perspectives. That is very, very useful. So we close this session now, and I won't dare wrap up with summarizing again that everyone said, because we covered diverse perspectives. David focused on the African, the finance issue. Arniko was exhibiting the ravages of climate change as it is happening in a very important part of the world. And Jamila linked planetary health with human health and this interdisciplinarity that is involved in this agenda. So we not only close the session, but we close the entire series. And I'd like to thank our partners, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Center for Public Impact for partnering with us on this series of events around the equity imperative, intragenerational equity, intergenerational equity that I believe probed quite successfully this week. And this is a nice segue to the larger discussions that will occur in New York this week and the next during the 76th UN General Assembly. Let me end with this striking fact. I was reading this article in Nature last year. So COVID has pretty much dominated all our discourses, and it has indeed been once in a century kind of an event. But people haven't noticed that 2020 and 2021, this particular time in human history, is also that threshold when, for the first time in 4.5 billion years, human-made materials are likely to exceed the weight of all life on planet, right? So this artificial stuff like metals and concrete and bricks and plastic now outweigh the biomass of all living plants and animals. So this is a once in an epoch. So we're also living in not just a once in a century event, we're living through a once in an epoch kind of an event where anthropogenic artificial mass will exceed 1 trillion tons, right? So this is where I think both the planetary health issues and all the havoc it is wreaking on other aspects of our life here on this planet are becoming evident. And this is, I guess, this adds to the urgency of responding to many of these issues. So thank you again for patiently bearing with us and joining us over the last 3 days. We will make available the video of these sessions to a broader global audience, and hopefully this will enrich the kind of discussions that we're having on these issues at a time when there are so many global negotiations happening, as Jeff Sachs mentioned at the beginning, from the G20 to COP15 to, of course, the COP26 in Glasgow next month. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.